Picture this. You and a few friends decide to build a house together. Not in your neighborhood, not in your city, not even on Earth at all, but in orbit, moving at over 17,000 miles per hour, circling the planet every 90 minutes. Oh, and each of your friends speaks a different language, grew up on the opposite side of the Cold War, and insists on using their own tools and designs. That, in short, is what humanity decided to do when we set out to build the International Space Station. The ISS is often described as the most expensive object ever built, with an estimated cost somewhere around $150 billion. To put that in perspective, you could buy the entire Disney Corporation about 3 times over. You could fund the Apollo program all the way to the moon 10 times. Or, if you were feeling really ambitious, you could feed every person on Earth for an entire year. Instead, we decided to build a floating laboratory in orbit, a gamble that could have ended in disaster, either technically or politically, but which became one of the most daring cooperative ventures in human history. And the gamble wasn't just about money. Imagine hundreds of thousands of parts manufactured across dozens of nations, shipped up to orbit in rocket launches that had to go perfectly. Imagine trusting your former Cold War rivals not only with your technology, but with your lives. Astronauts would have to rely on Russian rockets when American shuttles were grounded, and cosmonauts would share oxygen and water provided by American life support systems. In space, there are no second chances, no emergency rooms, no quick escapes. Everything about the ISS was a risk of failure, a risk of conflict, and a risk that the entire project could collapse before it ever got off the ground. Good evening, traveler. Tonight's story is about the gamble of building the International Space Station, and how it reshaped not only science, but the way humanity sees itself. Settle into your bed, get comfortable, and as you drift off, let's imagine together the enormous risks, struggles, and unlikely triumphs of a project that took decades, thousands of people, and countless sleepless nights to complete. While you're warm under your blankets, think of the astronauts who instead had to learn to sleep in orbit, floating in zero gravity, strapped into sleeping bags so they wouldn't drift across the room. Here's what's ahead in our journey tonight. First, we'll explore the world before the ISS, why nations even thought such a risky project was worth attempting, and what early space stations taught us about living off-planet. Then we'll dive into the political gamble, how former enemies like the United States and Russia learned to cooperate, and why this fragile partnership was so close to breaking apart. We'll move on to the engineering gamble, the incredible challenges of building a football field-sized laboratory in orbit, piece by piece, with nothing but rockets, robotic arms, and human hands. We'll look at the human gamble, the lives of astronauts and cosmonauts who volunteered to risk it all, training to survive everything from fire to decompression to simple loneliness. Then we'll explore the scientific payoff, why the ISS has become humanity's greatest laboratory, and what it has taught us about our planet, our bodies, and our future among the stars. Finally, we'll consider the legacy, what building the ISS says about us as a species, and how this gamble has paved the way for humanity's next great adventures. But first, let's step back and remember why this was such a gamble in the first place. By the time the ISS was first imagined in the late 20th century, humanity had already built space stations. The Soviets had launched Salyut and Mir, and the United States had briefly operated Skylab. Each was impressive in its own right, but they were small compared to what was envisioned for the ISS. Skylab was basically the size of a school bus. The ISS? Think more along the lines of an entire football field, complete with solar panels stretching out like giant wings. The gamble came from scale, yes, but also from timing. The Cold War had only just ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russia was struggling to find its footing. The United States was wary but saw an opportunity. Working together in space could prevent rivalry on Earth. This was, after all, the same Russia that had once raced America to the moon, the same Russia that had been stockpiling nuclear weapons just a decade earlier. And yet, instead of pulling further apart, the world's greatest rivals decided to build something together. It was, as one NASA official put it, a marriage of necessity, but like any marriage, it came with risks. Even within the United States, the idea of the ISS was controversial. Congress nearly killed the project in 1993, and at one point, the funding survived by just a single vote. Critics called it a boondoggle, a money pit, a floating white elephant that would never deliver on its promises. Supporters argued it was an investment in humanity's future, a chance to keep scientists, engineers, and astronauts dreaming bigger than just Earth. Every dollar spent, they said, was a bet that we could do more than fight wars and consume resources. We could create something together that transcended borders. The technical gamble was no less daunting. To assemble the ISS, NASA and Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, had to choreograph dozens of missions. Every launch carried modules, solar panels, or trusses that had to be carefully docked and bolted together in orbit. Astronauts went on hundreds of spacewalks, often lasting 6 or 7 hours at a time, wearing suits that kept them alive in the vacuum but left them clumsy and exhausted. The tiniest mistake, a drop bolt, a misaligned panel, could have catastrophic consequences. Imagine trying to build a Lego set while wearing oven mitts, floating upside down, while the entire set orbits Earth at 17,000 miles per hour. That's what astronauts faced on nearly every mission. And yet, slowly, piece by piece, the ISS took shape. The first module, Zarya, launched in 1998. Then came Unity, then Zvezda, and so on, until the station stretched longer than a football field, brighter than almost anything else in the night sky. The gamble was paying off, not because it was easy, but because the world had committed to doing something difficult, together. Of course, there were failures along the way. Space shuttles were lost, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, reminding everyone just how high the stakes really were. Budgets ballooned, deadlines slipped, and political arguments raged. At times, it seemed the ISS might never be completed. And yet, against all odds, it was. By the 2010s, the station had grown into a sprawling laboratory, home to astronauts from more than 20 different nations. As we drift deeper into tonight's story, keep in mind the human side of this gamble. The ISS isn't just metal and wires, it's people. People who risked their lives to build it, people who spent months away from their families to live aboard it, people who learned to trust one another in ways that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. For astronauts, the ISS was a test not just of technology, but of human endurance, learning how to eat, sleep, exercise, and even get along in the most extreme environment imaginable. And it's people who will benefit from the gamble too. The science being done aboard the ISS, studies of microgravity, human health, new materials, and even agriculture, will ripple far beyond orbit. It might help us one day survive on Mars, or cure diseases back on Earth, or simply see our planet from a new perspective, fragile and beautiful in the blackness of space. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, imagine this gamble not as something distant and abstract, but as a story of humanity taking a leap together. The ISS was risky, yes. It could have failed, yes. But it didn't. And in that success lies a quiet truth. Sometimes, the biggest gambles are the ones that remind us what we're capable of when we work side by side. In the 1970s, the first experiments with long-term space habitats began to reveal just how complex and precarious life off Earth really was. The Soviet Union launched a series of single-module stations known as Salyut, each a metal cylinder packed with instruments, bunks, and life support systems that were only barely capable of sustaining their crews. Inside these cramped stations, cosmonauts learned about the invisible enemies of orbital life, condensation that pooled on surfaces and shorted electronics, stale air that needed constant filtering, and bone and muscle loss that no amount of floating calisthenics could fully prevent. One early triumph turned tragic when the crew of Soyuz 11, returning from Salyut 1 in 1971, suffocated due to cabin depressurization. It was a harsh reminder that building even a temporary outpost in orbit was an endeavor where a single overlooked detail could mean disaster. Across the ocean, NASA shifted from the glory of the Apollo program to something more sustainable. Skylab, launched in 1973, was America's first stab at an orbital home. Converted from a Saturn rocket stage, it offered an interior spacious enough for astronauts to actually float from room to room. Crews performed solar observations, medical experiments, and daily exercise regimens designed to combat weightlessness. For a few years, Skylab looked like the first step toward a permanent human presence in space. But NASA had no shuttle ready to ferry supplies or make repairs, and by 1979, the station's orbit decayed until it re-entered the atmosphere in a fiery fall that scattered metal fragments across Australia. Skylab proved humans could live and work in orbit, but it also showed that sustaining such an effort required more reliable transport and funding than NASA yet possessed. The lessons of Skylab and Salyut shaped the next generation of designs. In the Soviet Union, engineers conceived of Mir, a modular station that could expand over time with new pressurized compartments, solar panels, and docking ports. Launched in 1986, Mir became a landmark of orbital endurance. Crews stayed aboard for months, conducting medicine, physics, and earth science. They learned how to recycle air, stretch food supplies, and endure the psychological toll of confinement. But the hardware was temperamental. In 1997, a resupply ship crashed into one of Mir's modules, causing decompression and near abandonment of the station. Fires and repeated power failures underscored how precarious the venture was, even after a decade of experience. Meanwhile, NASA pursued the Space Shuttle, a winged craft that could ferry heavy payloads into orbit and return to Earth for reuse. The shuttle was supposed to fly weekly, reducing the cost of access to space. It became the linchpin of America's vision for building a large station. Yet the vehicle was riddled with compromises. Thermal tiles required painstaking inspection after every flight, engines had to be rebuilt, and the cost of each launch soared far above projections. Then, in January 1986, Challenger disintegrated shortly after liftoff, killing all 7 aboard and grounding the fleet for years. What had been marketed as a routine vehicle suddenly seemed like one of the riskiest machines ever flown. Both sides were advancing in parallel, but neither had solved the fundamental equation of cost, safety, and sustainability. By the end of the 1980s, the idea of a permanent station in orbit was not a question of engineering alone, it was a political decision. The United States proposed Space Station Freedom, announced by President Reagan in 1984 as a bold outpost for the 21st century. But budgets ballooned and designs grew unwieldy. Every new revision meant billions added to the cost, and Congress grew skeptical. Some questioned whether the science could justify the price tag, especially when unmanned satellites could gather data more cheaply and safely. The Soviet Union faced its own crisis. Mir was impressive, but it strained the resources of a faltering superpower. By the time the USSR collapsed in 1991, Russia was scrambling just to keep Mir aloft. Talk of building an even larger replacement seemed out of reach. Out of necessity, the idea of collaboration emerged. For decades, American and Soviet space programs had been rivals, even enemies. Now, with the Soviet Union dissolved and Russia in need of cash, the possibility of pooling resources took hold. Bringing together two entirely different traditions of engineering proved daunting. Russian spacecraft used metric measurements, American systems used imperial. Russian designs favored redundancy and ruggedness, while American ones emphasized precision and cutting-edge electronics. Docking systems, power management, even the way crews were trained, all of it had to be negotiated and harmonized. It was like trying to fit together two puzzle sets from different manufacturers, each with its own logic. There were also diplomatic obstacles. Some in the US Congress balked at partnering with a former adversary. Others worried about sensitive technology being transferred. At several points in the early 1990s, funding for the project nearly collapsed altogether. Votes in Congress came within a handful of margins from canceling the entire plan. Still, advocates persisted. They argued that the station wasn't just about science, but about forging ties, reducing tensions, and creating a shared stake in space that no single nation could claim as its own. Slowly, compromise after compromise, the blueprint began to take form. Instead of space station freedom, there would be a true international space station, with contributions not only from the US and Russia, but also from Europe, Japan, and Canada. Each nation would contribute modules, technology, or launch systems. The Russians would provide early living quarters and docking experience, the Americans, heavy lift capabilities with the shuttle, Europe and Japan, laboratory modules, and robotics, Canada, its signature robotic arm. The design was modular, expandable, and, at least on paper, capable of lasting decades. By the mid-1990s, test runs had already begun. American shuttles visited Mir, docking with the Russian station and carrying out joint missions. These flights were more than symbolic, they provided invaluable training for multinational crews and a rehearsal for the larger station to come. Engineers studied how Russian and American systems could be integrated, astronauts learned each other's procedures, and political leaders used the missions as photo opportunities to emphasize the new partnership. Even so, the risks remained enormous. Funding shortfalls threatened to derail construction before it began. The complexity of the station meant that any major delay in one nation's contribution could ripple across the whole schedule. Some skeptics predicted the project would collapse under its own weight. Yet the momentum kept building. In 1998, the first module, Zarya, built by Russia with US money, launched into orbit. It was only a single piece of what would eventually become the largest structure ever assembled in space, but it represented a breakthrough decades in the making. The struggles of the early years were not wasted effort. The cramped tubes of Salyut, the roomy but short-lived Skylab, the patched-together Mir, and the unreliable shuttle all left behind a body of lessons that would inform the ISS. How to recycle water, how to design exercise equipment, how to dock autonomously, how to conduct repairs in weightlessness, all of it had been tested, sometimes painfully. Out of failure after failure, a foundation had been laid. The ISS was still years away from becoming fully functional, but the tipping point had been reached. After decades of rivalry, financial strain, and political brinkmanship, humanity had managed to keep the dream alive long enough to actually begin building it. The launch of Zarya in 1998 was just the beginning, but it immediately introduced a truth about the International Space Station. This was never going to be a single bold leap like Apollo 11, but a slow, delicate puzzle that would take years to piece together. Each new module, solar array, and docking port had to be flown into orbit, delicately maneuvered by astronauts and robotic arms, and then carefully bolted and wired into the growing structure. The complexity was staggering. By the early 2000s, the ISS was a patchwork of Russian and American elements with the promise of Europe and Japan's contribution still on the horizon. But building the station in orbit was unlike building anything on Earth. Every part had to be launched inside a rocket's payload bay or carried by the shuttle. That meant walls, girders, and laboratories were designed to fit like Lego pieces, but the construction site was a place where one wrong move could send tools tumbling off into the void forever. Imagine trying to put together a house with oven mitts on, while floating upside down, where even a dropped screw becomes a piece of high-speed debris. That was the daily work of astronauts and cosmonauts, sometimes spending 6, 7, or 8 hours outside on spacewalks to connect wires, install handrails, or fix panels. The early years also showed just how fragile the system could be. The station was meant to be a marvel of global cooperation, but every module added complexity. In 2000, the first permanent crew, 2 Russians and 1 American, arrived on board. From then on, there would never again be a day when the station was empty. But having people on board meant that life support systems, food deliveries, and constant maintenance became critical. Crews learned how quickly simple problems could spiral. In 2001, the Russian segment experienced computer failures that left the station briefly without orientation control. Solar arrays had to be manually adjusted to keep the batteries from draining completely. In those moments, the dream of a shining city in the sky seemed more like a collection of fragile metal cans. Even so, progress was undeniable. Each new addition gave astronauts more space, more science equipment, and more living comforts. Laboratories from Europe and Japan added capabilities that had never existed in orbit before. Experiments in fluid dynamics, biology, and materials science took advantage of microgravity in ways that couldn't be replicated on Earth. For the first time, scientists could watch how flames behaved in space, how crystals formed without the tug of gravity, how human bodies aged when freed from the constant pull of Earth. It wasn't just science for science's sake, it was data that would shape medicine, technology, and perhaps humanity's eventual path to Mars or beyond. But the world outside the station was not always cooperative. In 2003, the Columbia shuttle disaster once again grounded the American fleet. With the shuttle out of service for more than 2 years, only Russian Soyuz and Progress spacecraft could reach the ISS. Crews were cut back to a skeleton staff of just 2 or 3 people, just enough to keep the station alive. Construction slowed almost to a halt, and for a time, there was a real risk the ISS would stagnate or even fail. Yet the partnership held. Russia's Soyuz ships became lifelines, and the United States funneled resources into solving shuttle safety problems so construction could resume. When the shuttle flights returned, they came with a sense of urgency. Huge new truss segments, complete with massive solar wings, were carried up to expand the power grid. Canada's robotic arm, and later its more advanced sibling, the Dexter robot, became essential tools for moving components around. The station grew from a cramped outpost into something closer to a research village. By the late 2000s, photographs taken from departing shuttles showed a sprawling cross-shaped structure glittering in sunlight, large enough to be seen with the naked eye from Earth. The station's slow assembly created a unique cultural phenomenon among its crews. Unlike Apollo, where missions lasted a few days, or even Skylab and Mir, where stays were measured in months, the ISS became a place where humans could live for half a year or more at a time. Astronauts learned the rhythms of station life, daily planning conferences with Houston and Moscow, exercise sessions to keep muscles from withering, evenings watching Earth spin below from the cupola's panoramic windows. Crews marked holidays together, shared meals, and even played music in orbit. The station became more than a lab. It was a home. The strain of living in close quarters was real. Confined to modules the size of buses or vans, astronauts from different nations had to blend cultures, languages, and working styles. Misunderstandings happened. Tempers occasionally flared. But in many ways, the station became a floating social experiment, proof that people from once bitter rival nations could collaborate when survival depended on it. That alone carried enormous symbolic weight in the early 2000s, when tensions on Earth often ran high. As construction accelerated, the ISS also weathered practical threats. One of the most dangerous was orbital debris. Even a small bolt, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, could puncture a module. In 2009, a piece of debris came so close that the crew prepared to evacuate into their docked Soyuz ships. Fortunately, it missed, but it was a reminder that the station lived in a shooting gallery of space junk. Despite the risks, the vision kept moving forward. By 2011, the final shuttle flights carried up last pieces of the station. That same year, the shuttle program was retired, leaving Soyuz as the only means of reaching the outpost. For some, it seemed absurd, the largest, most expensive human construction ever placed in space, dependent entirely on rockets first designed in the 1960s. And yet, in practice, it worked. Crews rotated every 6 months, supply ships from Russia, Japan, and later private US companies like SpaceX kept food and experiments flowing, and the ISS became fully operational. It was only at that point, more than a decade after Zarya first launched, that the dream of a permanent orbiting research center had truly been realized. Looking back, it's almost astonishing that it came together at all. Political fights nearly killed it in its infancy. Disasters delayed it. Budget overruns haunted it. And yet, piece by piece, module by module, the gamble paid off. The ISS was never just about science or even engineering. It was about proving that something this vast, this improbable, could exist at all, a place in the sky where humanity, in all its messy divisions, could find common cause. Each completed segment, each successful handover between crews, each experiment carried out in weightlessness was another small proof that we could, for the first time in history, live off our planet not for days, not for months, but indefinitely. That fragile permanence was what made the ISS different from every station before it. It was not a test flight, not a temporary outpost, but a declaration humanity could survive in orbit, not just as visitors, but as residents. When the station finally reached something resembling its complete form, its impact began to ripple far beyond the circle of space agencies and engineers who had fought to make it real. The International Space Station was no longer just a project, it became a stage where nations could show what they valued, a laboratory where experiments could only be run in orbit, and, strangely enough, a kind of cultural symbol, proof that humanity, if it chose, could build something larger than any one country. The spread of its influence wasn't always visible in dramatic breakthroughs or headline-making events. Sometimes it was the quiet trickle of discoveries that slipped into daily life back on Earth. Studies on bone density in microgravity shaped new treatments for osteoporosis. Experiments on protein crystals led to advances in drug design. Research on fluids and combustion taught engineers how to make engines and medical devices more efficient. The very problem of surviving in orbit for months, managing water, recycling air, balancing nutrition, pushed forward the kind of technologies that ended up helping in places far from rockets, disaster zones, submarines, even hospitals. But beyond the practical, the ISS spread something harder to measure: perspective. Astronaut after astronaut described the overview effect, that shift in consciousness that came from looking out the window and seeing Earth as a fragile, glowing ball against the black emptiness of space. Crews from rival nations shared that view together, pointing out their hometowns, laughing as they passed over continents in just minutes. That vision filtered back down through photographs and live streams, making the station not just a lab but a symbol of unity. Its spread wasn't limited to science and symbolism, though. The station also transformed geopolitics in subtle ways. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, even as tensions rose on Earth, wars, sanctions, political rivalries, the ISS partnership remained intact. American astronauts rode Russian Soyuz rockets even as relations between Washington and Moscow soured. European and Japanese modules continued to operate despite shifting global alliances. In orbit, the station became a rare zone of cooperation, where treaties and agreements held firm even when rhetoric below grew bitter. It wasn't utopia, arguments over costs, responsibilities, and credit were constant, but it was a stubborn reminder that collaboration could survive in a place where failure wasn't an option. At the same time, the station transformed spaceflight itself. Before the ISS, human space travel was episodic. Missions launched, lasted days or weeks, then ended. After the ISS, it became continuous. For more than 2 decades, there hasn't been a single day when humans weren't in orbit. That permanence reshaped the way agencies planned missions, designed spacecraft, and thought about space as a frontier. Instead of flag-planting triumphs, the goal shifted toward sustainable presence. That mindset, in turn, laid the groundwork for private companies to step in. The retirement of the shuttle in 2011 was a turning point. With Soyuz as the only access to orbit, dependence on Russia became a sore point. It also created an opening for commercial players. SpaceX, Orbital Sciences, and later Boeing stepped into roles once reserved for governments, flying cargo, and eventually crew to the station. This was transformation on a different scale. Space travel itself was no longer purely the domain of superpowers. The ISS became both customer and testing ground for an emerging private industry. Each successful launch, each docking of a Dragon capsule or Cygnus freighter, marked a step toward a new model of exploration, one that wasn't solely bankrolled by national pride. The station's transformation also reached into education and culture. School children spoke with astronauts via radio or video link. High-definition cameras streamed Earth in real time, turning the planet into a shared spectacle. The cupola, that 7-window dome, became a kind of cultural icon, showing up in films, documentaries, even music videos. The ISS was no longer just a place where science happened, it was a place that entered the imagination of people who would never leave the ground. Still, the gamble remained. The ISS was always fragile, and its longevity was uncertain. Leaks, aging modules, and the constant threat of space debris reminded everyone that it wasn't built to last forever. Each repair mission, each patch over a microcrack, was a reminder of the risk. But paradoxically, those very risks underscored its importance. The station was proof that humanity could not only build something in orbit but keep it alive, nurture it, and adapt it as circumstances changed. As the 2020s unfolded, the conversation shifted toward what would come next. China launched its own space station, Tiangong, signaling that the era of a single global outpost might be ending. Private companies began sketching plans for commercial stations, hotels, and factories in orbit. NASA looked toward the Moon, with Artemis missions and a planned gateway station circling it. And yet, through all of this, the ISS remained, older, patched together, but still circling Earth every 90 minutes, carrying humans in its modules and experiments in its racks. The transformation was clear. What began as a gamble, a risky joint project between rivals, had become the foundation for the next phase of human spaceflight. The ISS was no longer the future, it was the bridge that carried us from the past of Cold War rivalries to the possibility of a truly multi-nation, even multi-industry, future in space. It's easy to forget that this spread and transformation happened in the quiet, almost invisible way of orbit. No cheering crowds, no ticker-tape parades. Just a continuous hum of machines, the shuffle of astronauts through modules, the glow of solar arrays against the black sky. That was the gamble paying off, not in one glorious moment, but in the slow, steady normalization of something once unthinkable, humans living permanently beyond Earth. The ISS today exists in a strange in-between state, still orbiting, still active, still generating science, but also undeniably aging. Its modules creak like the bones of a veteran athlete who's played far past their prime. Panels are weathered by micrometeoroid strikes, tiny leaks are monitored constantly, and systems need maintenance almost daily. Yet the fact that it has lasted so long, far longer than originally projected, is a legacy in itself. It shows what humans can do when engineering, money, and cooperation are sustained over decades. The legacy of the ISS begins with permanence. For the first time in history, humanity has established a continuous presence in space. Since November of 2000, not a single day has passed without at least one human circling the Earth aboard the station. That uninterrupted streak represents a shift in how we see space, not as a place for brief heroic visits, but as an environment to inhabit. The ISS normalized the extraordinary, making orbit routine, even mundane. And in doing so, it redefined human capability. Its scientific legacy is equally vast. Hundreds of experiments have only been possible in microgravity, studies of fluid dynamics, plant growth, combustion, protein structures, and the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body. These findings ripple back into medicine, technology, and industry on Earth. Doctors learned more about osteoporosis and muscle wasting by studying astronauts' bodies. Engineers learned how to recycle water more efficiently because every drop mattered in orbit. Even mundane tasks, like keeping air breathable, spurred innovations that later found use in hospitals and remote communities. The ISS's legacy is not just in the discoveries themselves but in proving that science could be done sustainably, at scale, in orbit. Culturally, the station's legacy is harder to measure but just as profound. Astronauts describe the overview effect, the life-altering perspective gained by seeing Earth as a fragile blue marble with no borders. That experience has been shared with millions through photos, videos, and live streams. The image of Earth from the cupola has become iconic, a reminder of both beauty and fragility. For 2 decades, children grew up with the knowledge that there were always people living above them, circling the planet. Space stopped being abstract, it became inhabited. Politically, the ISS stands as one of the rare success stories of post-Cold War cooperation. Even as Earth has seen wars, sanctions, and rivalries, the station endured as a joint project between countries that often disagreed on nearly everything else. NASA relied on Russia for rides to orbit for nearly a decade after the shuttle retired. European, Japanese, Canadian, and Russian contributions interlocked with American ones so thoroughly that no single nation could run the station alone. Its very structure forced collaboration. That persistence, even through political storms, may be one of the greatest diplomatic achievements of our age. But legacy is not just about what the ISS has been, it's about what comes after. Already, China's Tiangong station is operational, smaller but newer and more ambitious in some respects. Commercial companies are developing private stations, with visions of orbital hotels, manufacturing hubs, and research outposts. NASA has set its sights on the Moon, with plans for a gateway station in lunar orbit. And Mars, always looming in the imagination, will demand technologies and experiences that only the ISS could provide. The legacy of the station is as a bridge. It connected the age of national rivalry and one-off missions to an era of permanent human presence, multinational cooperation, and commercial opportunity. The risks that once made it a gamble are now its greatest lessons. The technical challenges, life support, radiation shielding, orbital assembly, have been proven solvable. The political gamble, will nations cooperate, has been answered with a cautious yes. The economic gamble, can such a costly project be justified, has been softened by the wealth of scientific returns and the foundation it laid for commercial ventures. In hindsight, the gamble looks less like a reckless risk and more like a necessary leap. Looking forward, the ISS reminds us that space is not about quick wins but about endurance. For more than 2 decades, its crew rotations, supply runs, and experiments have been a drumbeat of continuity. Its legacy is teaching us how to live not just in space, but with space, how to integrate it into our civilization as naturally as the sea or the sky. And so, when the ISS finally deorbits, when its last modules burn in the atmosphere and its long life comes to a fiery end, the legacy will not vanish. It will live on in the astronauts who trained there, the companies that supplied it, the nations that depended on it, and the generations who grew up knowing it was always there, quietly circling above. The ISS may one day be gone, but it will never truly disappear. It has already altered how humanity sees itself and how it sees its future.